right. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to HR Heretics. Today, we have Joop van der Voort, who is the CEO and founder of Remote. Prior to Remote, he was the VP of product at GitLab. My joke is that he is the king of Remote. And just some stats on Remote, which is just absolutely incredible. Founded in 2019, you now have more than 1,500 employees across 70 plus countries, tens of thousands of customers, a $3 billion valuation, and you've raised over $500 million in VC funding. Joop, it's awesome to have you on the show.
Happy to be here.
Thanks so much for being here.
So I want to get into running a remote company. Obviously, this is like what your product does, but you have been doing this for a long time. I think GitLab is maybe the best in the world at running remote companies, and now you're doing it yourself and helping enable everyone else to do it. What do you see as the things that companies get wrong as it relates to remote?
I mean, I don't think we know what is right, which is a weird thing to say, but like there's not a lot of shared understanding or even shared experience of remote working at all, let alone running a larger organization, right? That is distributed all over many different countries and where many people are working remotely. And so it's very hard to say if anybody is getting anything like particularly well, but I think there's a few things that are really obviously wrong. And I think the first and most obvious one is, well, if you are trying to replicate what you did in an office in a remote setting, you will fail. And I think that is mostly because the way that we act in offices is really outdated and it doesn't really match the current reality, but it's very easy. And so what I mean with that is that I think we manage a lot based on whether you see people, butts in seats. And we know rationally that that's not a really good way to manage. You should manage on output. Is somebody actually doing a good job? But we didn't have to learn that, because if you do walk into an office, you can sort of judge people by whether they are sitting in a seat, right? And so in a remote organization, obviously that doesn't work. And so you see all these tools coming, into reality that are helping to track people, to see, are they being active? Are they moving their mouse, right? And so that's a really, really obvious one, which is that, well, that's not the right way to do it. You should actually like set clear expectations for what is the kind of work that you expect people to deliver, and then look at that work. And then if they are not there, you coach them to get better, etc. And the other very big one is, of course, making people sit in meetings all day. I think sitting in meetings is something that most people don't really enjoy, let alone many hours at end. But I think in a setting where it is a Zoom meeting, it's even worse than sitting in a meeting room, because you get one, you're always staring at yourself, right? You always see your own little square. And so that, many people get very fatigued by that. But then there's also the thing that it feels very inhuman to look at a screen all the time, right? Much more so than sitting in a meeting room where there's more natural breaks, etc. And beyond that, it's just not necessary. And I think you feel that double when you have access to distractions, be that on your computer or outside of your computer, where you can do your mail at the same time. And everybody ends up doing this. Everybody's doing their mail while they're in a Zoom meeting. So why are you in this meeting in the first place? Which is actually, my point, which is you probably don't need to have this many meetings. Whether you are in an office or working remotely, you don't need to have a lot of meetings. And in fact, I would say meetings are a great tool when you use them appropriately, but for the most part, they're extremely heavily overused. And so that's a pretty big one. Too many meetings. That's a really big one. But ultimately, I don't think there's like a great, standard on remote work. So, when we ran GitLab, we created this handbook that is open so that other people could learn from it. And we do the same at Remote. And what we find is that, and it's quite intentionally so, is that there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences between the two companies. Part of it had to do with, the personality of Sid, the CEO of GitLab, and the personality of me running Remote. But also part of it has to do with tools as they evolved, right? We use Notion very heavily at Remote. We didn't have that at GitLab, so we had to sort of build our own solution for that. But also, we decided to do things in a different way, and we found that even though we do things very differently in some ways at Remote, it still works. And so to say, is Remote or GitLab doing one thing or the other better or worse, even though they're completely differently, we don't really know. And so that to me is like the real interesting bit, is that for the most part, we don't know. And you basically have to go in and like treat the building and running of the organization as a product. So something that you evaluate, where you look at like, what are the problems that I'm facing, and then can we iterate towards a state where we believe it is better, right? And as your company grows, the problems will change as well. Once your company gets really, really big, just like office-based companies, the problems in some ways get easier to solve because really big companies are so big, they have to think about how do we communicate across departments, across buildings, across different countries. And so your company starts to fall into those buckets, but it's the middle part that's really difficult, where you're not super big yet but you are highly distributed. And that's a very unique place to be as a remote and distributed company. And I think that's sort of where remote has been. 1,500 employees is big, but it's not like multinational giant corporation big, right? And so I don't know, I think that's a bunch
It's
of things
it's
that I
such a
think
big
are
topic,
tough.
obviously,
Yeah.
right now and for the past couple of years, and so many different opinions. And I completely agree with you that I think a lot of companies have tried to replicate the office experience remotely. I totally agree with that. And I guess my question for you is, besides like less meetings, Yop, what are the one or two things that you all have explicitly done that is not replicating that very explicitly, that might not be as obvious, or that other folks don't really do, that even have remote cultures?
So what are things that we
Yeah, like
do
are
or
there
don't?
any like very very explicit rules, policies, beliefs that you all practice to make this work that aren't very common out there?
Yeah, I think not having meetings is part of the greater wave of saying, well, we work asynchronous first. And I do think that that is mostly how GitLab worked as well and works. But it sort of says that you should always be able to do work and work independently. And a really large part of that means that you write stuff down so that people don't have to ask you for it. You do a good job of documenting things. But at remote, I think we were much less dogmatic than GitLab was in that way, and it still sort of worked out. Also, we have, I guess, the fallback of better tooling today. But above that, I think the most important thing was giving sufficient ownership to people to really manage themselves. And so nobody is being micromanaged in any capacity, and people are giving extreme flexibility and extreme ownership over their work. And I think that's the real big one, because if you do that, people start to self-organize both by themselves, but also in teams. So for example, in remote, much of our product is built in small teams. And those small teams, they have like a general sense of ownership. So there's, for example, a team that is responsible for identity management, right? So access to apps and whatever else. But like, that's all they know. That's their brief. And the company has particular goals, and a really, really high level goals, but like, that's their brief. It's like, this is what you're responsible for, figure it out. And then within that, they basically fully have to figure it out. And so they have full flexibility to not just figure out what are we working on, but also how do we work and how do we collaborate as a team. And so we are being zero prescriptive about it. And so what is interesting is that, for example, we don't say, well, we manage projects in a particular way, or we don't use particular agile methodologies. If you want to, you can. If that's something you want to do in your team, if you want to do a daily stand up, you can. There's like 3 out of the 50 or so teams that we have do that. If you want to get together, sometimes you can, but you don't have to. If you want, and so we give them extreme flexibility in that sense, and that's really interesting because it solves a lot of problems. Like, rather than trying to find something that works for everybody, you just let people figure themselves out, and that works really, really well. And I think we tend to stay away from like predefined frameworks and scripts and particular type of scaffolding in which we want everything to fit. That as long as you like reach your goals and you're able to effectively communicate about them and like operate in somewhat of a transparent way, so that if I come into your team and you ask you what are you working on, you can answer me and you can show me where I can find that answer myself. Then we don't really care about like how exactly do it. And it means that we can focus more on delivering rather than on busy work like process and reporting.
Yep. It's
So
outputs. It's outputs instead of inputs. And then
Yeah,
so I want to talk about hiring then,
sure.
because I think what you just said is really interesting, which is nobody is micromanaged. And if I go back to earlier in my career, I think a lot about what I learned from osmosis, just being in the office, like being around other people, hearing like what they're saying, being in conversations in the kitchen, and just as a listener. You don't get that as much in a remote culture. And so do you guys think about the seniority of your hires? Do you think about like, you have to be able to like be self-managed, and we don't hire new college grads, for example?
No, I think the premise is not true. I think the osmosis, standing in the kitchen, I think that's like extremely limited, right? I think your exposure is extremely limited and isolated to small locations over a really long period of time. Whereas if you go in our Slack, you can read what every single person is talking about in every single team in a company. And so there's the opportunity to self-serve information and to learn by osmosis, so to say, is far greater in our company than it is, I think, in a typical office workflow. You just have to do it. And like, there's a part of it which is like, well, how do you make that discoverable? But as much as you didn't have to discover where the kitchen was, well, you did on your first day.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that we point people to, well, this is where this team is working and this is where this team is working. But then if you are interested, or if you want to learn something from a particular team or expert or person, then that is just available to you at any point in time, however you want. Having said that, it's worth addressing it, right? If you want to hire more junior people, you have to provide the structure to be able to educate them and to level them up, etc. And when we start out as a company, we mostly hired senior people, particularly so in engineering. But it was more out of the choice of not wanting to spend the time to train people, right? Because I think training is an active thing. It's not a passive thing. Yeah, sure, you can have somebody passively learning on the job, but I don't actually think that's particularly effective. And I think it's mostly a waste of, that person's time and the money that you pay that person while they're. And so at one point we made an explicit decision where we said, well, we are going to train people. And in our case, so Remote uses this programming language called Elixir, which is, it's popular in the sense that people really like it, but it's not popular in the sense that there's a gazillion software engineers that actually are very comfortable with it. And so what we did is we said, well, we know that there's a finite supply of Elixir developers on the planet, but we need a whole lot of them, and we can probably exhaust the world of Elixir developers if we wanted. So we started to accept people that do not have any experience in it, and we are going to teach them, and we are going to give them the tools, and we are going to mentor them. That was the decision, and with the decision comes the decision to say, well, we may have to make sure that managers don't have too many reports. We have to make sure that there's a framework where, somebody who's new at this has a buddy and can learn from them. And essentially committing to the fact that we want to hire people that are more junior. And so we did, and it works fine, because in the end, it's, as long as you can spend sufficient time with somebody else, that is what is leading, not whether you're in the same room or not. Now, do you want to put a very junior person by themselves 12 hours in time zone away from everybody else? No, right. That's horrible. But you don't want to do that with anybody, right? You want people to be close together so that they can work together and they can collaborate, and that the cycle time, the time to make any particular decision or answer a question is as short as possible. And so in the end, if you really zoom out, the thing I always think to myself is like, what is the advantage about being able to see how tall somebody is and be able to smell them? And it's very little. And all the other bits you can make up, right? You can talk with each other. And if you really want, you can put an audio call on all day. And actually, there's some people that do that. They hang out in audio rooms all day working together.
See, that's interesting. That's kind of what I was getting at, is what do you do that many companies who are, even when they claim they're fully remote, might not do? And having a room that you can go in all day and see and hear other people, that's interesting. I've never heard of a company doing that.
I mean, it's a feature in Slack. So you can start a huddle and then you can just join any. But like, it's not like everybody in the company does that.
Right.
Like, there's a few people that like to do that occasionally. I think it's more about like having access to these kind of tools and having the awareness to be able to use them than anything else. Because for the most part, what we find is that if you give people a lot of tools, if you give them enough information, then they'll just do their job, especially like engineers who have to be focused and usually in quiet or at least in their own comfort zone to do exceptionally well. They thrive for the fact that they can concentrate for long periods of time.
Yes. I have one more question on hiring. And I can imagine this is a wonderful environment for many folks. I can also imagine it's not. a great way of working or an enjoyable way of working for some folks, right? I just go back to what you said about you can read on Slack all day long everything that's going on in the company. And some people that might make their head explode. How do you screen for that in the hiring process? And have you ever had to kind of 3 months in say, oh no, this isn't working? Has that happened a lot? Just curious.
I think, you need to be able to read and write well, which is a bigger hurdle than you might think, right? But other than that, I think these are things that you can coach people into. And so I always say the same thing. And I say this to people that are really junior to the company, this is their first job out of college, but I also say it to, C-level execs. And I even say to people that have experience working in remote companies before, is that just pace yourself where you enjoy it, because there's so much information. And you need to become very self-directed. If you let yourself be directed by notifications and unread channels, it's going to be really hard, because you cannot keep up with continuous information flowing from 1,500 people, right? You need to decide yourself what you're going to do. And so that ability, the ability to be independent and self-organizing and such, you can screen to a certain degree when you're hiring, right? You can ask for examples, but for the most part, I find that like if you hire intelligent people who have some career success or are really ambitious or very driven, they will be fine, and with a little bit of coaching they will be fine. Yeah, occasionally it doesn't work out, but I think that goes for any function, right? And it might not be specific to remote working. In my experience, it doesn't happen very often that we come across people that don't work remotely particularly well, but in all other ways check every single mark. Usually it's like, well, they don't communicate well. And if you don't communicate well, it's going to be hard to thrive in any situation, but that is going to be more obvious in a remote situation, because if you don't communicate well, it's like you don't exist.
Hey everyone, we'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
There's a world where your CRM is powerful, easily configured, and deeply intuitive. Attio makes that a reality. Attio is a radically new CRM built specifically for the new era of companies. It's flexible, easily configures to your unique data structures, works for any go-to-market motion from self-serve to sales-led. Attio automatically enriches your contacts, syncs your emails and calendar, lets you create powerful reports, and quickly build Zapier-style automations. The next era of companies deserves more than a one-size-fits-all CRM with an outdated UX. Join 11 labs, replicate, modal, and more. Try Attio instantly at attio.com. That's ATTIO.com, and tell them Nolan and Kelli from HR Heretics sent you. So we're in a really interesting time right now to where during COVID, every company was forced to go remote. And now we're seeing a pullback in the labor market, and we're seeing a forced return to office from many CEOs. And the general take is like, remote didn't work for us. We just saw Nike actually just say the same thing. Like, remote has not worked for us at all. We need people. We need butts in seats. That's how we do our best work. I'm curious, like, what your take is on those CEOs and venture capitalists who are saying like the only way to build a company is in person.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't worry about it too much. And the reason that I don't worry about it is because I think the fundamental forces that drive remote work, and in particular international hiring, right, which is ultimately what my company is all about, is the need for great talent. And the need for great talent remains really, really high. Pullback in the labor market doesn't refer to the entire labor market, but one thing that we see is that the demand for like great engineers, designers, whatever else, remains greater than like the supply of them. And that's a problem that is almost solved if you start hiring internationally. And for that reason, we continue to see companies more and more hire internationally. And yeah, you can't open an office anywhere the people are. And because people now know since the pandemic that, oh, I can totally do my work remotely, they have the ability, they have the leverage to demand it. And sufficient of them, more than 50% of all people, actually prefer to do work where they can work at least partially remotely. And so given those like fundamental forces, the only thing we see luckily is that hiring internationally and therefore remote work by itself is increasing. And so I understand that CEOs that have done a job for 40 years and 2 of them were remote in a really crazy time of the world Like they are like, for 40 years, for 36 years it went well, and then for 2 years we did it remotely and it didn't go particularly well. Let's go put it back and forth. Yeah, I can understand that. I think the change will take a really long time. I think it's almost like a generational change.
Yeah.
And I also think, as I said, like if you can't fully embrace it, it is going to be very difficult. So if you're going to try to replicate what you had before, as in your style of working, then yeah, it's going to be easy to go back to the office and you'll just fall back into what you did before, which, clearly worked for your company. And also you still have a lease to pay. So, there's that angle as well. Might as well use those offices that you had. And so I do really understand that it can be really difficult for companies to like meaningfully change the way that they work and wanting to go back to the way they did things, because, going from one state to the other is going to be very difficult. And it's going to be difficult for everybody involved, not just the executives, but everybody else as well, because they knew that they were working in a particular way. And if the company doesn't help them working in a different way, then yeah. So yeah, totally understand it. But yeah, fundamental forces drive us to have more and more remote work regardless of that. And so I think it's just that the pandemic rushed a change.
Yeah.
And I think a rush change is not necessarily a good thing, even though it helped my company, of course.
Joop, I was in the head of people role at GitHub at the same time you started GitLab. And we were, I think, across 35 states and 17 countries at that time, I think. And same thing, right? Very, very clear about documentation, reading. I mean, people wouldn't have conversations in the hallway about work because not everyone could see it. So you'd put it on the repo and you document it, et cetera, so everyone could participate. But I did find, especially when it came down to like organizational people, those types of movements, changes in the company, it was actually very hard. There was a lot of context missing. People miss things. They read it wrong. Like, how do you combat that? Because that's different than 4 engineers shipping something. I had a lot of trouble with that much distributed, that much on paper or screen.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that is one of the things that we at GitLab also got wrong, or at least we had to learn. And I think that is something that we meaningfully do different at remote. And then that is specifically that the threshold to work asynchronously, to write and read and to absorb information, cannot be higher for non-technical people than it is for technical people. Like, you cannot have a company culture that is designed specifically so that engineers can do the work really, really easily and nobody else does. And that was at GitLab. We required people to make commits, right? Which is like, sure, we made a tool to do it, but it was like really hard.
I was getting feedback on HR stuff via pull requests. So yeah, I think we were in the same boat.
Yeah, and it's like, it's a really myopic worldview to think that like that's actually a great user experience, and like, yeah, I mean, there's cool things about it, and like I would love everybody to learn Git, but like you're actually making things much harder than they should be. And so at remote, we solve it by 2 things, right? One is we use a modern tool, which didn't exist. We use Notion, which is really, really nice, and we use other tools that are like great to use. It's also a little bit my personal philosophy, which is that I don't think any tool should be hard to use, right? That's how we built our own software as well. It's like my belief is that, in our case, we built payroll software, right? So anybody should be able to run payroll, and not an accountant, because I feel like there's no reason that we don't make it easy for people. The only reason that it's hard is because nobody took the time to make it easy. So that's one. We make the tools really easy to use. And then the second one is that instead of going from the angle of like, oh, you have to be incredibly strict about following the protocols, we have to create a way of operating that is accessible, right? And that is inclusionary instead of exclusionary. So if you can't expect everybody to read all the things. Like, it's not realistic. Like, and it's also not like, you're not in touch with reality if you believe that everybody's going to read the documentation always, no matter how many times you're going to say it. Sometimes you just need to talk to people. And one of the things that every manager learns, or every leader learns, is that if you care about something, you have to repeat it a whole bunch of times. And so if your whole company culture is predicated on the fact that everything is written down, and if it's written down, you know it, right? Because the first thing you're going to do is like search for things. And if something's written down somewhere that you have to read, you're going to read it. I mean, it's not in touch with reality, because that's not how people operate. You need to tell people 700 times about the thing that you really care about before they start to get it. And also it's just really inconvenient, right? Like you become very process driven rather than this is actually what we care about. And so yeah, that's it. I think this is like the biggest difference between GitLab when I left, which to be clear is more than 5 years ago. Okay, it's a different company today, but GitLab when I left, and then when how we started remote and how we thought about like how do we communicate and such.
Mhm.
I've been building this company for 5.5 years, and I've not been convinced that taking less of a dogmatic approach around documentation and contributing to the documentation and reading from the documentation, I don't think it has adversely affected remote, right? And so I think it mostly has been positive that we tell people to document things and to work transparently, but we're not like, well, if you don't document it, it's not true and it doesn't happen and it always has to be documentation first. No, it's fine if you like sometimes like say something or like
Yeah, you can speak.
just speak up before you write it down. Like
I love that, Yop. It sounds like we were in the same boat back in 2014 with that, but it's very like responsible and evolved view, and I appreciate that. I have one more question, just based on my experience. I walked into GitHub, and I think again we were about 17 countries internationally, and kind of illegitimately, if you will, everyone was contractors, right?
Yeah.
They had been contractors for 2 years and built their lives around that, right? Tax loopholes. I mean, it was like cemented in 8 feet up, right? Like, don't change me. And it was like we had to unravel all of that, open up 17 entities. I just want to accent that saying you're in 87 countries sounds wonderful. And everyone's like, wow, it is a pain in the ass. And I just want to ask, do you open up these entities for everyone? How do you do that? I mean, what does that look like as far as Lyft? Because that was probably my least favorite project in my career.
Yeah, it's our business, right? So, remote started out and it is an employer of record. So we open entities and we have entities in more than 100 countries. And we have to do that ourselves. And it's a lot of work. And actually, for us, we do it because if you want to hire somebody in any given country, you hire them through our entity, right? So you don't have to set up your own entity. But for us, it means that, yes, we go through the pain. And actually for remote, the pain is like, at least twice as big because we're not setting up a normal entity, right? If at GitHub you had to open an entity, you said, okay, we're going to open up GitHub Australia so that we can hire people that work for us there. With remote, we have to open up remote Australia, taking into account that we're going to employ people instead of somebody else, some other third-party company that comes to us and says, I want to hire Jane and she lives in Brisbane but I don't have an entity there, so I'm going to use remote to hire her. And remote is going to be the liable employer, but I am the actual employer, and remote is going to wire her money. But also, if there's employment conflicts, and we have to take all those things into account and like figure out a way to operate there. And so yeah, it's a lot of work, but like it's blood, sweat, and tears. That's the answer. We just did it, and we keep going at it, and we continue to do it.
That's incredible. That's incredible. I wish you were around back then. I love it. It's so complex.
It is. There's other complexities too with managing a global employee base. One of them is compensation. Sure. And so I'm curious, not only for remote as a company, but also remote's customers, is how are you guys thinking about geography-based compensation? So at Carta, we had offices, I think it was in 3 or 4 countries when I was there. And we did geography-based compensation. And there's pros and cons. How are you guys thinking about it?
Yeah, there's no alternative, right? You're always going to end up with that model. And the reason is very simple. It's like the labor market is a market. And so it's supply and demand, and supply and demand is localized. And so we are trying to change that with remote by making it so easy to hire internationally that like the labor market becomes a true single global market. But the reality is that it's not. And so, it's very easy to fall into the ethical perspective, but that's not reality, right? Because we're not talking about ethics. We're talking about like what are the dynamics of a market, and they're very easy to explain. I am a company. I have a set budget. I have $100 to spend. And with those $100, I want to hire as many people that has as big of an impact as possible. And I want to hire great people. But if I go in San Francisco, I can hire 2 people because it costs $50 each. If I go elsewhere, then depending on like what are the local rates for example, developers, I might be able to hire 10 people in the UK for that. And so am I going to pay the people in the UK $50 each and only hire 2 of them because of ethical perspective? Well, my company's going to grow slower and I just have people that are wildly overcompensated relative to the local market. No, of course not. I'm going to pay whatever is locally competitive because that's what will bring those people to my company. If I offer them $12 instead of 10, which is the local rate, they will join my company. They are happy and I am happy because I'm still able to hire a whole bunch more people, right? That's market dynamics. And so market dynamics will drive labor. And if you do anything in another direction, you're going to go against the grain and it's going to have the consequences that come with that, right? So one approach is to say, well, we're going to pay everybody equally. Well, then how much are you going to pay people? Because if you pay people everything, San Francisco, which is like the top of the market, you can hire much fewer people, much fewer. And the people you will attract will be people from literally every place in the world because everybody wants to be paid like that. And you're going to attract a lot of people that approach you only for the salary. You might say that's fine. But like as a company, it's probably not a very wise thing to do. If you don't pay top of the market, then you cannot hire the best person for the role. And every company says they want to hire the best person for the role, but you're basically saying, well, then we cannot hire people in San Francisco. Okay, so then what is the max that you're going to set? And then, okay, so we're going to exclude a large part of the world. And so now we're going to only be present in particular markets. And this is actually a very reasonable approach. But the same problem comes again, which is like, okay, but like, as I say, I put the level at UK, which is slightly below San Francisco. Am I now only going to hire in that market, or am I also going to pay significantly overpay in other markets? You know, and you run into the same problem endlessly. And so at the end, what you're going to do is you're going to pay what the market says. And you're going to say, well, we're going to, relative to the local market, pay a certain percentile, right? We want to be at a certain range. We want to be 50th percentile, right? If we want to straight in the median, or maybe we're going to be a really well-paying employer. We're going to be in the 80th percentile in any given market. Then you have a good approach, because for anybody in any given market, you pay a great salary. And as a business, you get the benefit of saying, well, we want to hire the best person. We're going to hire regardless of geography, or maybe up to a certain cap. But we also get the savings, so to say, of hiring people from all over the world. And we still pay them well, because we literally pay more than 79% of employers, right? Because we're paying 80th percentile. And so that's what you're always going to run into. Any alternative path, you're going to run into that, because at scale, it doesn't work to have these like ethics-based compensation policies. The only thing you can go against is like long-term to like solve this compensation inequality is to start a company that makes it easier to hire people internationally. Because if you do that really, really well, and that company becomes wildly successful, what you see, and I can tell you from data that I have, that salaries in exceptionally low salaried locations, so for example, I used to live in the north of Portugal, they start to rise because companies start hiring people there, and the people that get hired there, they tell their friends, you don't have to work for €1,000 a month. You can earn a €4,000 a month, which is approximately what happened in the north of Portugal with salaries. The local software engineers went from 1,000 to 1,500 on the average to about 4,500, €5,000 on the average. €5,000 is about $6,000. Pretty shitty salary for San Francisco, but it's fantastic for North Portugal. And so who's complaining this situation? Nobody. People on the internet, on Twitter, but other than that, nobody.
So I agree with you that when you are hiring globally, you have to think about location-based compensation. I think the challenge is once people are in the company, and then you're thinking about internal equity. So engineer in San Francisco versus engineer in Rio. And we're looking at performance, and engineer in Rio has higher performance than engineer in San Francisco.
Yep.
And so in your mind, what you're saying is, yeah, like that's just the reality of global hiring and global employee management is such that even though the engineer in San Francisco is a lower performer than engineer in Rio, the engineer in San Francisco makes more money.
Yeah, that's how it works.
Let's start with the comp first, right? Stay true to that and then manage. How would you reward the other engineer over the SF engineer, Joop? Would you, equity, is anything else come into play besides pay?
You can't discriminate in other ways, right? So everybody has, you should have leveling. You have levels, you have salary bands, and if somebody performs well, they should grow in their bands or they should go up in levels. And those levels, they are corrected to local pay, and that's the reality of it. And then the moment that local pay gets up to a certain level, or a person is so exceptional in their role that they can demand global pricing, which is probably like a long term, if you get like the top 1% of the market, then maybe that changes things. But for the most part, that's just not the reality, right? And like as an employer, you should separate the two things. You should manage performance. You should, have a great compensation framework and structure. But if you are going to do this at every stage, that's not really fun for anybody involved, right? And like it's not productive either. Then it's not worth having that discussion. You should just actively manage performance, period. And then you can follow the same routine every single time. Like, do you want to then just fire everybody in San Francisco, only hire people in Brazil or wherever else, and then performance level those people? It gets you nothing, that kind of discussion.
It's a really interesting take. And I think it plays in theory up until the Brazilian engineer puts a notice. And like this is how it always works, is right. We always think about location-based compensation, and we set the mark until like the competing offer comes in. And I have a lot of friends right now who are hiring aggressively in India, also in Brazil. Yeah. And those markets, we're seeing like the data isn't keeping up with how fast those markets are moving. And there's like, now people are coming into the table with like, hey, I just got this new offer. And so actually tell us what you're seeing in the data as it relates to like, how fast are those emerging markets compensation rising?
Yeah, that's a great one. So we have a compensation benchmarking tool in Remote, and we know that this is really valuable because ours is live data rather than data from months ago, because we throw it out. Like it's active, it's what people are earning today and not what they used to earn. And now the data becomes stale. And like, it's really hard to pin because countries are big and these distributions are not direct, right? And so what happens is that the ranges of compensations within any given role within a particular region or country expand, where indeed like the top 1% might far exceed everybody else, right?
Yeah,
which is
huge outlier.
In our case, it's we show you the quartiles, right? Like in one of those air boxes. And like we do that because then you get an idea of like where does it happen. But over time, of course, the median shifts, right? And that is explicitly our purpose. And so as a company, you just have to be reactive to this, right? And so if you do see that, and you have to be honest about it, you will have to adjust over time your compensation bands, and particularly in lower markets. And like there's a few tricks you can do, right? You can say, well, we're not going to pay under a certain level, or we're going to like pay everybody at least a certain percent. Like, you say, well, we do a local pay, but like we adjust it upwards in the lower end of it. And like you can do all sorts of creative things where essentially you are contributing to slightly overpaying people locally, but also to give you margin to like prevent these kind of cases. Because again, it's a market, and you don't have to win or lose the market. You have to just be, go along with it and be rational about it. And you also have to be rational about the fact that, if you have a high performer and the market says high performers should be paid more, you should adjust to that reality, right? That's it. It's just, if the market's moving fast, you have no choice. But it's a great luxury for everybody involved that we can do this right now, right? And I much rather have a world where everybody gets paid equally, but like rent is not equal everywhere either. And for what it's worth, the top percentage of talent will always remain the top, because the statistic will always remain the top percentage of talent. And so it's not like naturally it's going to change so that everybody suddenly falls in it. Not everybody in Brazil is going to be paid like in San Francisco, because the market dynamics are against that, because the rent prices don't follow that, and the rest of the population is also not at that level, right? We're getting into really macroeconomics, but you can think of it in that sense. You cannot forever adjust, and as a company you have to continue to be rational, and you can also not create a compensation framework which is super crazy and like super broad, because then nobody can make sense of anything anymore. They get income disparity between people in the same country in the same role, and you don't want it either.
Joop, what is your take on mobility, either advice you give to customers or at remote with employees moving around? I want to move to Portugal from San Francisco. What do you do with me, if anything?
Yeah, I mean, for us, mobility is huge in all sorts of ways. You said mobility, and I got triggered because we have a large team called mobility, and the team is responsible for visa and immigration and work permits, etc.
Geographical mobility.
Yeah,
Let's do that.
yeah. Well, actually, I mean, it's the source of all. That causes us to need to have
That's
this
true.
team.
That's true.
I'll start with an anecdote. So I do once every month or so, I do a welcome call where we bring in all the new people that have joined the company. We talk and they ask me whatever questions they want. And it was so nice. I did one this morning, and almost every person on the call, there were like 40 people, almost every person on that call was a certain nationality, but lived in a completely different country. I think almost without exception. And I think that's really, really nice. And it's like one of the perks of like the job and like the kind of people you attract as well. So there's a few ways to think about it. I think it's tough, and like there's not a true solution to it. I think generally the way to treat it, and also if you want to do things compliantly, somebody's employed in a country, right? And so this is our role as an employer of record, and so we do this well appropriately as well. Which is somebody's employed in a particular country, so they actually need to live in that country and be in that country for, I think, at least 181 or 182 days, something like that. And so that is our assumption. If somebody moves to a different country, they need a new contract. And like the fairest way to think about this is to say, well, if you want that, we will have to give you a new offer. And that is something that we can discuss. We can decide to not give you a new offer if you decide to move to another country. And the way we have done it internally at Remote, but also generally how I think it works really well, is that you have clear guidelines about this, where you say like, well, in certain situation, we will offer it if performance is good, but generally it's not a given, because the system would be very easy to abuse, right? Because you would say you would apply from a low-cost country and you would move to a high-cost country, right? Or worse, you would apply from a high-cost country, get a really high salary, move to a low-cost country, and now you create this massive income disparity. So that's really, really, really difficult. And so it's important you set really clear guidelines before you encounter these kind of cases, and just demand that everybody's transparent and honest about these kind of things. So for example, asking in advance, are you planning to move within the next period? So I have this really great hire reporting to me, and he told us, I am going to move from one country on one side of the planet to the other side of the country. And then we accounted for that. We said, look, okay, this is what's going to happen, right? This is what's going to happen to your compensation. Do you agree with that? Because we're going to pay you more now and less later, because your cost is going to be much lower. And if we set you in that market, then your compensation would be way out of the bands that we have set. Do you agree with that? And he said, yes, I agree with that. And so we agreed upon that, and that was it. And so that's sort of how to do it, but it is not easy. And like another good thing to do, for example, or like, is to have policies around, do I allow people to actually move out within the first year of employment, right? Because you're creating a huge headache for the company, but you're also creating all sorts of interesting, complicated labor law situations where, somebody might gain more rights to unemployment, if they let go, they get paid more in some situations. Like, it is actually really, really complex. And so the best course of action is to create clear guidelines. And if you don't have them, our team can help, of course, with that, but being really clear about that. But generally, like, people have to be adults. And if somebody tries to scam you out of money in these kind of tricks, they are not a good employee, period. So like, there's also a really good.
Yeah, I'm sure there are other things going on as well.
Yeah, like you don't want to work with people that are actively trying to scam you out of money. But there are going to be many edge cases where you have to figure it out, because somebody is working for the company for 10 months, didn't expect to have to move. They are a high performer. You're like, well, normally wouldn't do this, but they're a high performer, so I want to support it. It works out in the edge cases.
Yeah. So I just want to cap this conversation. So many HR folks I've talked to struggle. We're trying to create rules around this and that. And you said something, Joop, that I had not heard before. And I think it's a really great way to think about this and change the mindset of the employee is, we will issue you a new offer. And in that, it could be a no offer decision.
Yeah.
I had never heard it that way. It was just assumed I'm moving, I get this or this or this. And we talk a lot about marketing, right, Nolan, in different episodes, and packaging and semantics. And that phrase, I think it's so helpful to use off the bat. And I think it just sets expectations just by saying that.
Yeah, we did the same actually at GitLab. So it was the same policy. It is useful for everybody involved, and I think it is just fair. It sets expectation incredibly clearly. I think one interesting angle is that this is a very different angle, but a CEO, I have all these functions reporting to. If you're doing finance and you're planning for headcount, one thing that we started to do is plan for headcount period. So like the average cost of headcount, or like median cost, instead of planning for a specific cost of any given hire. And if you do that, then that decision doesn't become a financial decision, because if somebody moves within the bands, like long term, it will not have a large impact on your financial plan, right? Unless literally the whole company moves from one place to the most expensive place, but that won't happen, right? Statistically, that won't happen. And so you want to take away the need for you to evaluate people and to see them purely as like a cost.
Yeah.
This is just like one row of cost, in our sheet, and like how are we going to adjust it, and like what is there. You don't want to do that. You want to take that away. But you do want to have the freedom to say, look, you're breaking your contract. You're literally quitting from this company in this country. We as an employer are not happy about your performance. For us, that's it sounds harsh, but like for us, we don't want to continue. We don't want to like commit to paying you yet another year, basically guaranteed to insert the markets of salary, just because you decided to move, right?
I love that.
Then
it's so
there's a massive
and
imbalance in power.
Yeah, so simple and so clean and impactful. I love that.
Yeah. Also, the world is messy, and I appreciate your candor and transparency for how to deal with these complex topics. Last question for me is around just the hiring market. So there's been about 500,000 tech employees who have lost their jobs since 2022. What does your data say about the global hiring market and what's going on there?
Yeah, it's funny, right? Because we are biased, because we mostly see our company grows for many reasons, not just because markets are growing. And so from our perspective, the market is growing as a whole. And we do see that there's a lot of companies that have died, which is why a lot of people lost their jobs. But also because the large tech company fired a gazillion people, and those people also got new jobs, and many of them got new jobs globally. But what we see is kind of boring, which is that large economies hire more people and continue to do so. And there are some trends in how many people are being hired and at which rate. And I remember in the first wave of layoffs hit, which I think was 2022, start of the summer, Northern Hemisphere, I should say that. It's not the same for everybody. We saw like a wave of layoffs. And I think this was like, following the layoffs and like some of the big tech companies, some startups take that opportunity. They think there's like a macroeconomic shift. And so they sort of bandwagon along, right? And we saw that a few times happening over the past years, in 2022 in particular. Recently, we haven't really seen that. We haven't seen waves, right? There's been news, and sometimes there's interesting news, but we have not actually seen that correlate to like waves of layoffs. And hiring itself continues to grow, right? But I think our view is very biased because our company is growing, is getting more well known, and generally I think more companies are hiring internationally more and more over time as well. We do see accelerations in hiring, so we see that happening in waves as like people become more optimistic, as VC funding starts to pick up, or particular categories like we have a number of companies that are AI companies. You can imagine how they hire, but for the most part we see like reasonable optimism, not as much as like shortly after the pandemic when remote working and remote hiring shot up through the sky, but in absolute numbers for us it's much bigger than it was then because we are a bigger company.
Would you say that companies specifically in the United States, employees specifically in the United States should be concerned about wage growth given that they now have to compete on a global scale?
No, I don't think so. I think again, labor market works as a market, right? And I think if you have something that is valuable, the market will always reward it. I do think that you are competing with more people. That's true. But I don't think as an individual, you should not worry about like macroeconomic activity impacting your personal situation. I think you should make sure you do work that fulfills you. And if you do it really well, you will always find a job that pays well relative to where you live. That said, I do think that even just saying like the US is kind of like you're shortcutting a large part of the world, right? Because the reality for the East and the West Coast is very different from literally the rest of the US, right? Like,
true.
It's like if you live in San Francisco or New York, your expectation, but also the need for you to earn really, really high is very different than almost any other place in the US, with the exception of maybe, I don't know, if you go all the way to Seattle or to Austin or something. And so, no, but like I do think that your potential of earning more if you are not near a metropolitan area or particularly on either of the coasts is far greater than it's ever been if you work in tech or if you are a knowledge worker, right? And you start working from home. And so I think that potential is far greater. And so, translated in like normal human activity, if you want to live in a bigger house and you don't care about living in a city, the best time is now. You can just like buy a big house somewhere where it's cheap and live a great life. And that is easier than it's ever been for people in the US, for people outside of the US, and virtually everywhere else. And if you do want to live in the city, then that's also totally possible. And there's still a whole bunch of companies that still have offices there. They will have no choice but to pay local salaries, even if other global companies might not feel the need to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Life is about trade-offs. Yop, thanks so much for the time. This was incredible.
This was great, Yop. Thank you. It's so good to meet you.
Anytime.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.